This is Brent, and in this video we're taking our overhead squat assessment up a notch. Now, in our previous videos, we went through sign by sign and we discussed what each sign implicates as far as long and short muscles, which muscles are overactive and underactive. But what you've already started to notice is that you never get an overhead squat assessment where you look down at your template and you have one box checked. That's a nice thought. I hope to meet that individual eventually where I get a very simple corrective exercise program, but most of the time we start to see several boxes checked off. If you've really been paying attention and you've really done a lot of overhead squat assessments, what you probably started to recognize is that there's a pattern to which boxes get checked off. Now these patterns develop into clusters. These clusters start to implicate compensation patterns. Now in this video we're going to go over the lower leg dysfunction compensation pattern. So we're going to see certain signs packaged together, and you're going to see this over and over and over again. So now we're taking our ability as assessors to go from seeing one sign to seeing the entire compensation pattern packaged together. I'm going to have my friend Melissa come out and she's going to demonstrate what this looks like, which I know you guys have seen a million times before. If I get her all set up, second toe pointing forward, arms up over her head, her feet are hip width or in line with her ASIS, and I go, okay, and she's going to exaggerate this for me. I go ahead and squat. And we watched her feet turn out, her feet are flat, and her knees kissed. How many times have you guys seen that? You guys have seen that a ton, right? And then if you looked at her from the lateral view, go ahead and turn face that way for me. She does the same thing, right? Knees kissed, feet turn out, feet flattened, but then you guys also notice she has excessive forward lean, a little anterior pelvic tilt. And then when we turned her around, she may or may not even have an asymmetrical weight shift. How many of you guys have seen all of this packaged together? Well, mechanically, we can describe this. Lower leg dysfunction, if I was going to say there was a root to lower leg dysfunction starts with the inability to dorsiflex far enough. All right? Remember, dorsiflexion is just not foot up this way, but the ability to translate the knee forward. That ability to translate the knees forward, so go down into your squat a little bit, is also what keeps her center of mass, right? We can think like kind of in this core area. That's what keeps it over her base of support. So we can already explain the excessive forward lean. If she can't dorsiflex far enough, she has to, her butt ends up way out behind her and she has to throw her upper body mass over, creating that excessive forward lean just to keep her center of mass over her base of support. Let's get a little bit more technical though. Some of you guys have heard of this concept of relative flexibility. So if I have hypomobility, a restriction at one joint, I start compensating with hypermobility at other joints. She can't dorsiflex enough. So just for her body to try to get some more motion, her feet flatten out, which is going to cause problems. And then she steals even a little mobility from her knees by doing this. Go ahead and go down into your squat. This little turnout thing, all right? So she can't dorsiflex here. She's stealing from here and here. Well, hypermobility, hypomobility, and then of course that leads to hip dysfunction because tibial external rotation is femoral internal rotation, which drives tightness in her TFL, which is also a hip flexor, and that's going to cause an anterior pelvic tilt. So I know I just said a lot. These signs aren't separate though. They're actually all mechanically linked as Melissa's body here tries to figure out how to work around this one restriction that started with an inability to dorsiflex. If you guys go back and look at all of your solutions tables, you'll even notice that the muscles involved in, like, let's say feet flatten and feet turn out, both the lateral gastroc will flatten the feet and turn out the feet. Right, you guys saw that. Feet turn out and knees bow in. Lateral gastroc, biceps femoris, TFL. Knees bow in. Lateral gastroc, biceps femoris, TFL, and gluteus minimus. You see all of this overlap. it's almost disingenuous for us to start the way we did, which is with individual signs. It's actually these entire patterns that the body tries to create. So, going back to our overhead squat assessment now, you guys just took yourselves up a notch by realizing that it's not individual signs, but clusters of signs that we're looking for. The one thing we have to make sure we do now, though, is make sure that it is the ankle that is driving this dysfunction and not the lumbopelvic hip complex. Some of you guys have already seen that squat with modifications for further assessment. So stay with me here for a second. Sure, knees bow in can be driven by the fact that her feet turn out. Right? So that's tibial external rotation, which causes relative femoral internal rotation and causes her knees to collapse as she goes down into a squat. But she can put her feet back here. If she just had like an anterior pelvic tilt, which was driving overactivity of her TFL, gluteus minimus, and anterior adductors, that could also drive her knees in. Go ahead and squat for me. But that would be coming from the lumbopelvic hip complex. So before I start fixing here, I need to make sure that the dysfunction is being driven here in her lower leg versus being driven by the lumbopelvic hip complex, and that's actually fairly easy to do. All I have to do is take my ankle out of the movement. If I take my ankle out of this and everything miraculously gets better, then I know that's where the dysfunction comes from, and that's what I'm going to correct. So I'll have her do her overhead squat, and I'll do all of my signs. All right, so let's go ahead and see the overhead squat. Hands over your head. Good. Do your squat. We see feet turn out. We see knees bow in. That's our anterior view. All right, lateral view. Hands up over her head. She squats down. I see an excessive forward lean, an anterior pelvic tilt. Posterior view. Good. And I see a little asymmetrical weight shift to the left. Great. Now what I'm going to do is go, okay, where is this coming from? I'm going to have her get on high heels. So I'm going to put her in a whole bunch of plantar flexion, so now that dorsiflexion restriction is not an issue. I do get a lot of questions on how high this needs to be. You guys need to pick a platform, whether it's a couple weight plates, foam, half foam roll, rolled up mats, the backs of someone's shoes. It does have to be high enough so that they don't show their ankle signs. Basically, feet flatten and feet turn out. If they still feet turn out and feet flatten, your platform here for their high heels isn't high enough. For this, I think she's going to be fine. So she's going to go ahead and throw her hands up over her head and squat. And you notice that all of this stuff gets cleaned up. So we know that her knee and her ankle signs, of course, were actually coming from lower leg dysfunction. If I turn her sideways, she squats. Notice how that excessive forward lean disappears. I know that was coming from here. We do see something interesting with Melissa. She still has an anterior pelvic tilt. All right, so that anterior pelvic tilt is probably coming from a lumbopelvic hip complex dysfunction. I can even double check and have her put her hands on her hips. All right, and go ahead and stand up, do one more for me. We still see that anterior pelvic tilt. So most of her signs are coming from lower leg dysfunction. That's probably what I would aim for first, but chances are I'm going to have to come back and look at the lumbopelvic hip complex specifically and write a program to fix this. If I go posterior view, we said in the posterior view before we saw an asymmetrical weight shift. She was faking it, but let's pretend that we saw an asymmetrical weight shift. And then we put her in high heels and it went away. A lot of you guys have been asking me for an asymmetrical weight shift video, and I'm going to do just one specifically dedicated to the asymmetrical weight shift. But I do find a lot of people have an asymmetrical weight shift not because of something that's going on here, but because they actually had one calf or one ankle or one-sided lower leg dysfunction that when they squatted down was forcing them over. You're not going to correct this then. Even though it's an asymmetrical weight shift, I wouldn't go after this. I would go after the tighter side of their lower leg dysfunction. Thank you, Melissa. So, big step, guys. You just took a huge, huge, huge step. We just went from looking at signs of dysfunction to what the body actually really tries to do, which is create a compensation pattern. Now, before you freak out and go, oh my goodness, that is a lot of stuff I have to correct, it's actually not that bad. When you start looking at how overlapping the muscles in those signs were, how mechanically linked those joint signs were, you start realizing it's not a very long list at all. Despite all of the stuff we just saw, it only comes down to lateral gastroc, soleus fibularis, biceps femoris, TFL, VL, ITB complex, and gluteus minimus. That's 6 release techniques. If you go back and look at some of the stretching videos, the lateral gastroc, soleus, and fibularis muscles get stretched together in that modified slant board stretch I showed. So we're already condensing down pretty quick. This gets its own stretch. The gluteus minimus and TFL get stretched together. Tibialis posterior and medial gastroc get activated together. So that still only leaves us, let's see here, 5 activation techniques. And then we have our integration techniques. Even when we get really, really complicated, it doesn't amount to more than 20 techniques, let's say, or 25 techniques, or even if you're really, really sophisticated and can do all this different manual stuff, 30 techniques. Try to keep in mind this isn't like resistance training. I'm not having them do multiple sets of this stuff over and over again. I'm going through each muscle, doing what I need to do, one set apiece. People do not get rest between sets. I guarantee at the minimum, let's say this takes 16 or 17 techniques to correct everything from ankle all the way up to here. I could get somebody to do that in 20 minutes. It might take 2 or 3 sessions before they can get through it in 20 minutes. But eventually, that's 1 minute per technique, and they're just rocking through it. And you're fixing the entire compensation pattern, which makes sure you leave a lot less behind so that your outcomes are a lot better. Your carryover from session to session is a lot better. And this is what gets really cool. So I want you guys to look up this article on BrentBrookbush.com that I wrote. It's under postural dysfunction and movement impairment, called lower leg dysfunction. You'll be able to see where I start combining these signs and it starts implicating all of this other cool stuff. Like we can start looking at subsystem activation. In this dysfunctional pattern, we see that the deep longitudinal subsystem and anterior oblique subsystem become overactive, but the posterior oblique subsystem and lateral subsystem become underactive. You can't really even look at that stuff though until you see the entire package. Everybody's talking about fascia. Everybody's talking about it. But we know fascia isn't a single joint, a single sign thing. It spans several joints. It connects lots of muscles. Well, once we're looking at several joints, we do start to see a little bit of that fascial connection. We see the TFL, VL, ITB complex come in. Right? We see the tibial internal rotators, which have this tendinous fascial connection at the medial knee, come in. Lots of stuff going on here. If you guys look back at the deep longitudinal subsystem, you'll see that that's actually a huge fascial system, including the sacrotuberous ligament and the deep layers of the thoracolumbar fascia. So, we're taking a big step, guys. I know, we're taking a huge step. We're going from signs to patterns to integrated functional anatomy and some really sophisticated exercise techniques and routine design. But that gives us a whole lot more to work with. I think you guys are gonna have a whole lot of fun with it. It's basically unending what you could possibly do with all of this information. I hope you guys have fun. I look forward to hearing about your outcomes.